Hello, my name is Michael Quigley. I am the lead developer for zrok, and today we're putting out version 0.4. So I thought I would do a little video and just kind of walk through some stuff and talk about zrok a little bit, and just kind of have you over like you came to my office and wanted me to talk about zrok. So I figured it'd be fun. I kind of need to do this sort of thing more often for multiple reasons. It's been busy. It's been a lot of stuff going on with zrok and a lot of work to do to kind of get 0.4 out the door. So I will do my best to try and make more time to do these kinds of things. I think it's I know personally I enjoy kind of watching other developers work, and I kind of enjoy, the thought process more than I enjoy reading docs and that sort of thing. I mean, that's also helpful, but sometimes it's just really nice to kind of, sit with somebody and see what they're working on and talk to them about it. So I figured we'd do that. So what we're looking at here, this is my development environment where I actually work on zrok. It's a VM running under VMware on a Windows host, and I use it for all kinds of stuff, but it's where I do my zrok development. So I typically run a terminal program called Tilix. I like Tilix because it lets you split windows and do all kinds of crazy stuff with splits and sessions and stuff. So I typically have a Tilix session that has a bunch of these windows in it. I'll show you what they're for as we kind of move forward, but I set them all up with the same sort of environment. So let's just take that history, 1968, and what it's going to do is set my go path, and I typically stick, for every project I'm working on, I stick in local, I stick a folder for it, for its dependencies and its bin folder, and I add it to my path, and I change to that directory. So we kind of want all these windows set up the same. And there we go. So that's done. In my local environment, I usually run a couple of dependencies we need to take care of also. So Tilix also, in addition to splitting windows, lets you run multiple sessions. So I'll start another session and split this. And what I'm going to do here is, if we do a docker ps-a, you can see there's a Docker container called influxd that's not running. So let's go ahead and start that up. zrok, I think as far back as maybe 0.2, has used influxdb for its metrics repository. That's still the case in 0.4. Metrics has changed a lot. It's grown a lot. It's much more robust now. So let's go ahead and run influxd, and then the other. Oops, I didn't often do that. Not run. I want start. Okay, start that container up. Zrok metrics come from OpenZiti, and it gets it from fabric usage events out of OpenZiti. Those can be delivered to the zrok controller a bunch of different ways. One of the more scalable ways we've got is using AMQP. So you can take usage data out of OpenZiti over AMQP and then fan it out across a bunch of zrok controllers, which is what we're doing in production. So in my development environment, I kind of mimic that same approach. So I'll always run a RabbitMQ. And this is just kicking off another Docker container that's ephemeral. You kill it, it goes away. And so we keep RabbitMQ running there. Let me just make sure I've deleted my zrok and my Ziti Express install. Let's make sure I've deleted my zrok DB. I'm often, in my local environment, I'll often use the SQLite version because I can just, with one command, delete the database and recreate it if I need to. So the next thing we're going to do, we've got our RabbitMQ, our influxd. Now we need an OpenZiti network. So what I do this so frequently, I keep this shortcut here, so I can probably should just alias it in my shell practically. So that runs the OpenZiti Express install script basically. So we're going to go ahead and, which will create us a Ziti network with a controller and a router, configure control plane and all that sort of stuff. So part of that process is it generates an admin password. So I'm going to copy that and let it proceed. Pulls down the latest version of Ziti, which is 28.4 as of the time of this video. Generates all the PKI and does all the things that Ziti needs. Zrok's fairly tolerant of whatever Ziti network you want it to use it with, but part of my process is to always be updating to the latest and making sure everything's still continuing to work the way I want it to work. So I replace the ZD network fairly frequently. So now that we've created that, there's a couple things we need to do. So the first one is I keep my zrok controller configuration in etc dev.yaml. If you look in the git ignore for the project, I've got it set up to exclude that path. So in my dev.yaml at the bottom, there's the password for the ZD network goes there. So this config stanza tells the zrok controller where to talk to the OpenZiti management plane, the control plane. So yeah, this is sort of, none of these secrets are secret. They're all just local influxes and things like that. So even if you have this token, it doesn't matter. It's just running on localhost in my VM here, so I don't really care. Yeah, so the important thing about 0.4, you can see this v:3 here. If you're running a 0.3 zrok service instance, that'll be set to 2. So every time we make breaking changes to the configuration, I'm going to go ahead and increment that number. So if we try and run the zrok controller with that config file, it's going to complain. So it's going to say, expecting configuration version 3, your configuration version is 2. Please see the docs, basically. So what that is telling you to do is if we open up my local configuration again, set that back to 3, what that wants you to do is I do my level best to, yeah, I want to be in that Etsy folder, do my level best to keep this controller.yaml updated with documented details of how the configuration structure is set up for the version of zrok you're working with. So I you know, try and write decent descriptions of what's going on with all of these things. So you should definitely refer to this commented version of the controller configuration. Use it as a starting point if you're making your own service instance for zrok, or you've got an existing one and you want to update it. You might even, you know, I'll often just grab a merge tool and take the old config and then the template and merge them together. That way I can kind of update things. But ultimately you want to end up with a new configuration structure. So we'll go over some of these details when we start doing things. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and close that for now. So now we've got let's put it back to 3, save it. So now that we've got our Express install done, we've got our ZD network done, we've got our dependencies in place, what we need to do with this ZD network before we can use it for zrok is we need to adjust the ZD controller and the ZD edge router configuration. So I'm going to go to the directory where that quick start, that Express install sticks all of the components, which is that .zd quick start and then the name of the network. So then what I'm going to do is open the controller configuration and the, if I can type, edge router configuration. Oops. If I could type, we don't care about that. Okay, so we've got our controller configuration here for ZD and our edge router configuration here. So I'm also going to open up, if I go to repos, NetFoundry, zrok, docs, guides, metrics and limits, configuring metrics. So this document describes how to set up metrics, including how to use the bridges and a bunch of other things that are new in here. But we need to adjust our ZD controller configuration to include this stanza. So let's go back to the controller configuration, go to the bottom of the file and paste that in. And what that's doing to our ZD controllers, it's saying for the event infrastructure, make a new subscriber called JSON logger that basically subscribes to Fabric usage version 3 events and writes them to a JSON file, and here's the path. So we're going to use that with a little piece of zrok infrastructure called the metrics bridge that will tail this file and basically append those events to AMQP. You can do that a number of different ways with zrok, and that's described in this metrics doc. There's other ways to do this. You can have your zrok controller talk directly to the ZD controller over WebSockets. You can have it tail the file itself. A bunch of things you can do, but I'm running this way so that I can sort of mimic what's going on with the production environment. I didn't mean to do that. Right, so we put that section in. The next thing we need to do is in the network section of the OpenZiti controller configuration, we need to add this little bit too. So what this little bit does is, let's take this and paste this in. What this basically does is it speeds up how quickly OpenZiti emits the usage data and the size of the bucket for the usage data. So we want them both to be 5 seconds. We want metrics every 5 seconds for the last 5 seconds is what that says. So that's everything we need to change in the OpenZiti controller configuration. Go to the edge router, same deal. We kind of need to tell it, the edge router, to emit metrics every 5 seconds for the last 5 seconds. Put that in there, and then our Ziti configuration should be good to go. So now we've created the network, we've configured it, so we can go ahead and start our controller, and we can start our router. And if we do, we can see we've got our router and controller processes running. So great, we got all our dependencies in place. The next thing we need to do now is zrok includes something called admin bootstrap. And admin bootstrap will talk to the control plane of Ziti and configure the Ziti network for zrok. So in version 0.3 and 0.4 of zrok kind of assumes that you're running zrok on an OpenZiti network that's dedicated to zrok. It doesn't have to. You can certainly run it on an existing Ziti network, but it doesn't make that process significantly easy for you. In future releases of zrok, I'll probably add some facilities to allow you to easily add and remove zrok from an OpenZiti network and make that a little easier for people that want to do that and want to have more control over that life cycle of zrok attaching and being unattached from a Ziti network. But for now, let's go ahead and bootstrap that new network. And if we look at what it did, it actually prepares the zrok database also. So if you're running Postgres or SQLite, it goes ahead and does the migrations, does all that sort of stuff, creates the identities, creates whatever policies need to be done, and it spits out this warning saying missing public front end for Ziti ID, whatever. Please use zrok admin create front end. So what that's saying is, in this new zrok configuration, there's no public front end. So if you want to do a share public, there's no public front end to use. So we have to create that. You don't have to create that if you don't care about public sharing with your zrok service instance. Like if you just want to support private shares, you can leave this out and it'll work just fine. But for completeness, let's go ahead and do that. So the next thing I need to do is, if we do a zrok status, you can see that I've got no configuration in this my local instance. It's complaining about unable to open zrok metadata, unable to load your local environment. Those are just warnings saying that your shell environment doesn't have any zrok details. So, and by default, the zrok binary is hardwired to talk to api.zrok.io, which is NetFoundry's public zrok instance that is available for everybody. I want to adjust that because we're working against my local environment. So I'm going to say zrok set config set API endpoint HTTP localhost 1880, right? Which now if we do a zrok status, you can see it says it's configured for that, source config. One of the warnings went away because it stored that local configuration. Now it has that metadata, but it's still saying unable to load your local environment means your environment isn't enabled. So now we're configured to talk to this controller once it's running. So we'll start our controller, right? And then we can take that admin create front end command that I copied and go ahead and create our front end. So this, you give it the DNS name, and for public front ends, it typically needs to be a wildcard DNS name. So when zrok creates public shares, it will substitute token in for the share token. I use this wildcard name, which just points to localhost, and it's just useful for my development environment. So we'll go ahead and run that, and that creates our public front end. So now we have a working zrok instance that we can go ahead and invite ourselves to. So let's talk about invites real quick. So if I come over here, let's just open up my configuration file, right? So there's this new invites section in the configuration, and it says invites open true, token strategy store, which is commented out, and token contact, right? So I'm just going to set this to false, right? So if we say invites open false, what's going to happen if we restart our zrok controller? If I do a zrok invite, it's going to say that service instance is not currently accepting new users. That's because we've configured it to not allow people to invite themselves to it, which is handy. Like if you're running a closed private instance, you don't want anyone to be able to invite themselves to it necessarily. The tokens do help with that. So you can, if you have open invites and you use tokens, well, then not anyone can invite themselves without a token. So you still got control. But let's just imagine you're running a single user or a couple users, something along those lines. You just want to lock it down. You can just turn off invites altogether, which is what that does. So if we come back over here and turn that on, because we need to invite ourselves, if I enable token strategy store and I have invites turned on, what's going to happen if I restart this is we've readjusted this now so that you don't have to say -- token on zrok invite command line anymore. Now, if the instance requires a token, it just prompts you for it. So we tried to make that a little bit more usable. But for my own personal purposes, I don't care about that for this instance because nobody can talk to it anyways. So it's running on localhost. So let's just go ahead and invite ourselves. All right. And then I don't even care about the email. I'm just going to grab the registration token out of here. And then in this bottom window is where I typically run the Node UI for development. So let's just run that. And then I'm going to say register and paste my token in here. I'm going to go ahead and set my password. And then we can go ahead and log into the web portal. All right, so there's a brand new empty zrok 0.4. And then we're going to, we're good to go. So the next thing we need to run is the metrics bridge. So if we do a zrok controller metrics bridge etc dev YAML, and we run that, that will then tail that the JSON file where the usage data comes out of OpenZiti and send it over AMQP. And then the other thing I run is I'll do a zrok access public, right? So there we go. So now we've got all the components that we need to run zrok, and I typically use these two windows for testing and various things when I'm working with zrok. So that's kind of why I keep all these 6 windows open. So once I've got a new instance up and running, one of the first things I'll run is a zrok test loop public. Oops, I forgot to enable. So let's go back to the web console, detail, grab the account token, enable it. Great. Now we'll do zrok test loop public, which is a built-in loopback testing tool, and it basically creates a public share and loops, generates some random data, sends it to itself, and validates that it's working correctly. You can run multiple loopers, and you can run multiple instances and things like that. So it's a useful load testing tool. 0.4 on the public instance now has limits and things. We're making them very, 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 very generous. We're talking like, you know, multiples of gigabytes per day kinds of things, but we are going to have limits. So you definitely don't want to run a bunch of loopback tests against the public instance. So yeah, now we've got a working instance. So let's go through the configuration again and talk about what else is new. Yeah, the metrics stuff. So in 0.3, the metrics worked very differently. When you run a public front end, like this public front end, the metrics was sort of coming from that and being shipped over the OpenZiti network to the zrok controller. Now all that metrics data is coming from OpenZiti directly, which means we now have metrics for private shares and all kinds of shares. Now we've got the new tunneling stuff, all that stuff. All the metrics works correctly across, no matter what you're doing with zrok now. So let's go right into like tunnels and stuff. So if we do a zrok share, and you can't do a share public with tunnels. So one of the reasons why we could at some point potentially do something with that with public tunnels, but let's say you want to, you know, share a port on publicly, like we'd have to have some IP address where that port is basically bound to. So it's much more expensive resource-wise to try and share ports publicly versus like a public front end is using a host header. So it's much less expensive to do public sharing for HTTP because you can just use the host header and the DNS name to route you to the correct share. Whereas a port, like you kind of have to burn a port on an IP address. So for 0.4, we kind of made the decision to say, hey, if you're going to do tunnels with zrok, let's do them privately. That way you can bind it to the local host where the user is that's trying to use the share. And that's, you know, again, one of the powerful things about zrok is that we have private sharing. So for tunnels, we took advantage of that. So if we do a zrok share private backend mode TCP tunnel, 192.168.9.1, and that's my OpenSense firewall. If we run that, that gives us our access private command. So if we run, let's split this window again. So if we run that, right now, if we do a netcat against the address of the access endpoint, so this is the user sharing the tunnel, and this is the user accessing it, and these could very easily be on different hosts entirely. They're just on the same machine for now, but we'll use this address, which is where the tunnel is listening. So if we do 001.91.91, we get an OpenSSH header, right? So, so it kind of does what you expect. There are some new log messages that come out of the latest OpenZiti SDK for Golang that I might submit a PR to try and tone them down a little bit. If you ever see log messages in these clients, you can just hit L and it makes them go away. It'll pop back open again if there's a new log message, but yeah, you can just hit L and close that. So yeah, that's basically the tunnels. Let's go ahead and do a zrok share public. Let's go back and do that again, right? So let's just run that again, and let's actually point this to a web server somewhere. So let's do 9.1 on port 443, right? Just stick it somewhere like that. It's just going to throw some errors, but I just want to generate some traffic. So if we do curl 27001, all right, it's going to complain, but I just want to generate some traffic. So if we look at the new web console, what's new here is, first of all, we're getting actual traffic for tunnels and private shares and things like that. We look at metrics, we can see we've got some metrics in here, right? Yeah, so why there's historical metrics in here? You're probably wondering, well, you just created this zrok network. Where all this history come from, right? Why it's still here is because I've got that long-running influx repository, right? So if we do a docker ps, this influx db repository that's running it's been running for a long time, and I do lots of work, load testing and that sort of stuff. So I don't empty that between zrok OpenZiti network recreations. So that's just showing us historical data. That's why that's still there. But yeah, so the new Spark lines are kind of cool. Like it shows, read and write separately, and tried to make the colors look more like the Zrok.io website and just try and update the look and feel a little bit. The the colors are a little different now. Now I included these icons. So I expect the stuff will continue to evolve and continue to work on making the usability better. We do show the access in here now, and what this dashed line is because this is a share and this is the access. So this is the share private and this is the access private. So what the dashed lines show is if the access and the share are both owned by the same account, you can see the connections between them. We might at some point in the future, have more details for accesses that are from other users that aren't your account and things like that. We'll see. We'll continue to evolve as things grow and change. But for now, if you've got the access and the share in the same account, it shows a dashed line between them, which I think is kind of cool. There's metrics at the account level, right? So you can show the account level. You can show it at that's the environment level. The account level also has that, right? The account level also shows all the environments with a Spark line now. In addition to the 0.3 just showed the environment and its shares. So you can kind of see that stuff at different levels of detail now, which is kind of nice. Other than that, I mean, things are kind of the same. Like the way that this works now is if we want to, if you get on a smaller screen, it will split this way, right? So it splits more like a phone style. So it goes back to the stacked top version. But if you're on a big enough screen, it goes side by side. I just feel like that's a better way to look at the stuff. Like it's a more effective use of space. We'll again continue to evolve some of this stuff, but yeah, that's the tunnels is the big thing. So he works with both TCP and UDP, which is kind of nice. I don't have a UDP application handy, so it's yeah, I don't have one handy to show off. DNS works pretty well. But yeah, that's new. There's a limit system that's new. Like I said, that's, that will be coming in the public zrok.io instance. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions, and let me know if you want me to do more of these.